Hi, this is Jim Hennager. It's December 24th, and we've had a change in the weather. I tried to show you a little bit of what was happening outside. It's surprise snow. None of the forecast indicated it was going to snow today, but here it is. So right on time before Christmas. Doesn't sound like it's going to last too long, but it's kind of a pleasant surprise. More like what we expect here in Iowa during December. So this is Table Talk with a new independent party. Today I'm moving into another area where I would think that we should look into a macro solution that is being overlooked, and it deals with what's happening in agriculture. In the early 50s, my father, who was a World War II veteran, came out of that with a family of three, and wanted to get into farming. So we had a farm up in northeast Iowa, Fayette County, for a number of years. I grew up my early years on the farm, so I understand a little bit about the culture, the background of farming. We had hogs, we had cattle, we had milking cows. My mother had both egg-laying chickens and broilers, and Dad grew corn, beans, oats, hay, and even tried growing potatoes for a while up on this 120-acre farm. Now, a lot of the farmers in the United States at this time all came out of World War II. They all got into the GI Bill, and they were able to borrow funds to get started. Not to really buy the land, but to buy some older equipment, farm equipment. And we had an old Ford tractor and a two-row corn picker. And I remember helping on the farm. Even when I was 5, I can remember helping to pick up straw shocks, they were called, by driving a horse. We used horses even then. Not so much on our farm, but there was a thrashing ring, one of these big old thrashing machines was used to separate the oats and the straw. And it had a very interesting feel to living there. I can still remember the smells of the barn, the milking area. I can still smell the hog houses and the chicken houses. So there's a certain part of culture to farming, particularly that kind of farming, small scale and family kind of farms. In Iowa in the 50s, we probably had close to 350,000 farms, small farms. They averaged about 120 acres, and they were a significant part of the economy here in Iowa. The average farmer probably devoted almost 3,000 hours a year to their farm. Most of them were males, but the family were all involved. The wife helped, had different things that were involved in the farm, and the kids. And the American dream in the 50s definitely was for the farmer to have some children that would grow up and take over that farm at some point. So the average age probably was 38, 40 years old, and as we move forward, we move into the 50s and 60s. Land was pretty cheap. I believe my grandfather, who also farmed up near Sumner, was able to buy the neighbor's farm for $150 an acre, for example. And that was going on then. A farmer would buy up the neighbor's farm when they retired, and the farms began to increase. By the 70s, we probably saw the average farm at around 200, 240 acres, and the average age now had been 10 or 15 years older, in the 40s, and they probably were putting in still over 3,000 hours of work. Now, if you jump ahead to 1990, the number of farms drops down to 90,000. So we went from 350,000 to 90,000 in a matter of 20, 30 years, and things changed dramatically. The average farm in the 90s now was around 600 acres, and a lot had changed in how they farmed. In the 90s, we saw most of the cattle being sold off, and fences torn down, buildings being torn down. In fact, you could drive from Des Moines, Iowa to Waterloo, Iowa, probably a 3-hour drive, and not ever see a farm that had any livestock on it. So the livestock went from the individual farms to confinement centers. We saw in that time period Iowa become the nation's leader in hogs, one of the leaders in cattle, and one of the leaders in milking. But they were in confinement centers, large centers where there were thousands and thousands of hogs, and same with cattle. A lot of the cattle moved down into the Texas Panhandle. And the farmer, now they were probably in their 50s, and first the wife would say, I didn't want to do the eggs anymore, and then the farmer would say, I really don't want to get up every day and milk the cows. And then last to go was the cattle and hogs, and a lot of that had to do with a change of lifestyle. They were getting older, they didn't want to work from morning till night, and so the farms changed over that period of time. But there was another variable that came into it in the late 70s that impacted farming in Iowa the most, and that was that the Federal Reserve moved its interest rate, prime interest rate, from the 3, 4, 5 range up into the 8, 9%, and commercial banks and the Federal Land Bank, they moved their interest rates up dramatically. From about 78 to 85 in that time period, we saw interest rates, not just to farmers, to everybody, go up dramatically. In fact, I can remember some interest rates as high as 18%, 22, 23%, and it just collapsed our economy. Now, the Federal Reserve said it was necessary because inflation was getting out of control. I really haven't seen any evidence of that. I know there was some inflation, but obviously it put the brakes on our economy, and a lot of people suffered. It wasn't just the farmers. Small businesses, small manufacturing, the housing industry, they all suffered dramatically. And what happened to farmers was a catastrophe. We had those farmers that were lucky in this time period who in the 60s and early 70s were able to maybe buy the neighbor's farm or a quarter section or a couple 40-acre plots of land, and they probably had most of that paid down when this hit in 1978. But those farmers that were trying to expand right close to 1978, they found themselves with a change in policy on the federal level, where the Federal Land Bank and the farm credit unions that were loaning money to farmers, they said because they were in a recession, everybody was in a recession, they had to reappraise those farms and the land, and they downsized the amount of value to land. Now, farms were probably selling in the late 70s for close to $1,000 an acre. So if you had bought a farm in like 74, 75, 76 and you paid $1,000 an acre, all of a sudden the Federal Land Bank and banks in general were saying that they couldn't appraise it at that amount anymore. And so they might have lowered it to $800 or $700. And then they wanted to reevaluate the loans. So if a farmer had gotten in and bought his land maybe with very little amount down, all of a sudden they found that the bank wanted 20% on a much lower value of their farm, and so they found themselves upside down. The land was not worth what the bank was saying it was, and their loan was higher than the appraised value. Banks demanded that be corrected. They either had to come up with cash to bring up the equity in their property, or they had to sell part of the farm. We get some arguments and we still hear them today, from agricultural specialists, agriculture economists, and from universities, and the argument was that this was a normal fluctuation in the farm community, that the strong farmers, the best farmers, were going to survive in this time period. And we saw a general move from small farms to large farm operators, and the economies of scale benefited these people because they could make more profit. I think both of those are a bunch of bullwinkle, to be honest. I don't think either one of those arguments stand up when you really look at them. In fact, I know personally some very good farmers in that time period who had never missed a mortgage payment, and they were running a very good farm operation. Usually it was a mix of a lot of different products that they were working with, and the whole family was involved. And by that time they were still spending 3,000 hours a year in that farm. But the larger farmer, who are now getting into 600, 1,000, 2,000 acres, they were the ones to give up the livestock, and they went to basically growing corn and beans. So Iowa became known as the leading producer of both corn and beans, and some new farming practices began when the farmer, instead of working 3,000 hours, was now working maybe 1,000 hours, and just having to plant his crops, take care of them during the summer, harvest them in the fall. And a lot of farmers started going to Texas or Florida in the winter months because they were approaching 60 years old. Another phenomenon happened during this time period that is more sociological in nature, and that is that the children of these farm families often went to college. They found that there was a lot of opportunities out there, and not so many kids wanted to come back and farm. So here the farmer was finding that the only way that he could really prosper was to take over the neighbor's farm and grow, and that was helped a lot in the 78 to 85 time period, because the banks, the insurance companies had, here in Iowa, over 200,000 farms went to foreclosure. And in a couple of years, the banks and insurance companies wanted to get these farms off their books. So it was that farm set that had lucked through this crisis that were invited to pick up the farms around them. And suddenly we saw a number of farmers, bounce up to 10,000 acres. And of the 90,000 farmers that were present in the 1990s, their average age was close to 60, and they were corn and bean farmers. But of that 90,000 farms, there were only 30,000 of those farmers that were actually producing more than 100,000 in revenue. So we really had gone from 350,000 farms down to 30,000 real farmers. The other 60,000 farmers were what you might call hobby farmers or very small farmers, and they probably had an off-farm job where they worked at a manufacturer, or they would teach or whatever, which is exactly what my father did. He left farming in about 1955 and went into teaching, which now gives you the rest of the story on my story. We moved from farming to education. He taught history, which should tell you where I picked up my interest in history and education. And I have to thank my father for showing me, the books, the literature, and how important education was. I've kept that with me, for a long time. He died in 1986, prematurely, in my opinion. It was too bad, but he was an elementary principal. And in my family, my sister stayed in education, elementary, and then administration. My brother was in administration at a university, and of course I was teaching at the college level most of those years, or in college administration. So you see that transition from farming to other kinds of occupation that was happening in the younger people. And what we saw were investors from outside of farming coming in. I know of a case in Fayette County where one dentist out of Chicago bought something like 14 different dairy farms, got rid of all the dairy cows, and just rented those out. And he wasn't really farming the farm anymore. He was leasing it out and taking 50% of the income off of the crops. But what his expectation was that the land value would go up, and that he would be able to, as an investor, sell that land at a later time, which turned out to be true for most investors. The land values in Iowa have just skyrocketed, and in the last 5 years, you could find farms, some of the better crops farms, were selling for 15, 16, 17,000. I remember a farm actually selling for 20,000 an acre. But there's no way that you can farm the land and pay that amount of money and have it cost out as far as having crops or any kind of income. These people are farming the land for the value of the land. They're investors. They're wanting the land price to go up and up. Now, so I hope you understand that this was an artificial situation that the federal government, the Federal Reserve, was involved in, and they caused this crisis in the farm. And we saw some weekends there'd be a dozen or more farms sales all over Iowa. There were sales, and we saw farmers hanging themselves in the barn and the machine shed, and generally a lot of chaos during those years. I fault the Federal Reserve and the banking system because what they did was they cut off credit to the farmers. They reevaluated their farms, called in the mortgages, and caused a lot of good people to have to move to cities. So what we saw was in Iowa, we have 99 counties, 950 towns, and today we have over 500 of those towns with less than 500 people. And the farming community has been decimated. Just a few thousand farms in each county, and now half of those farms are rented. There's an absentee owner involved in it because the owners of the land are in their 70s, 80s. We still have farmers, out in the field, and they're in their 80s. Well, that's their choice. Sometimes they have children that can help them, but often it's a matter of leasing or renting that land out. So a completely different change in the value, a different idea of the value of the land, a different idea of how we were farming and what it meant to what was traditionally the family farm. A dramatic change, okay? Now, part of that also came in the 90s when certain chemical companies got into farming and they developed GMOs. Now, I'm not a fan of GMOs in farming. I support the science of GMOs because it makes sense to be able to develop crops that can, survive in more arid situations or more wet situations or have a shorter time period in growing. But what I have a problem with, what I have a problem with is a science that allows the farm chemicals to come up through the crop, and that's what exactly is happening with GMOs. The pesticides, the herbicides are coming up into the plants because they're resistant to those chemicals, and it's helped the farmer out tremendously because they no longer have to cultivate the land in the summer. They get perfect bean fields with no weeds, and they get a better price at the elevator because of that. But I think the public has suffered. That's a very controversial statement to make. Those companies and the scientists behind it, as well as the environmental people, they've had to do with this for 20 years, but it certainly appears that the farm chemicals are coming up through the beans and the corn product. They're going into the feedstock. They're being picked up in the meat of the cows, the hogs, even in the milk. And there's a lot of science that shows that, so that those products are now coming into the human. And they're products that stay in your body for a long period of time. They accumulate. And I believe that we're going to someday clearly state that these chemicals coming through these products are causing the sudden growth of cancers in humans. You can't go from 1900, when we had like 1 in 100,000 getting cancer, to today when we have in some cases 1 in 9 women getting breast cancer, and we have 1 in 4, 1 in 5 men getting prostate cancer. That hasn't happened by coincidence. It's happening because of the chemicals coming into our body, and one way that those chemicals are coming in is through the farm crops. I'm sorry, that's just the bottom line. You can believe me or you don't have to, but I would urge you to check into it. So we saw some dramatic changes in the farm community. They certainly went to fewer and fewer farms. They went to more chemical kinds of strategies. They went to larger and larger equipment. The tractor my dad bought for $1,000, a used Ford tractor, was replaced with a $15,000 tractor, which was replaced by a $50,000 tractor, which was now, you probably pay $125,000 for a good tractor that could, pull a 16-row corn planter. And the combines, that 2-row corn picker my dad had, probably only paid $700 or $800 for. Combines today can go for $400,000. So what has happened is that the input costs to farming have gone up dramatically, and it's interesting that from the 70s, 80s, 90s, we saw corn and bean prices. Corn was about $3.50 a bushel, and beans were about $9 a bushel. All of a sudden, in the time period after 2008, suddenly beans went up to $17 and corn went up to $9.50. And these farmers that were in business, having 10,000 acres, and they were making a lot of money. We saw a lot of farmers buy up more and more farms. I know of a farmer near here that actually bought a farm for his wife and one for both of his boys because they were making excellent profits. Now we go back to the experts in the ag business, the ag economists, and they're going to say, see, I told you, economies of scale work. By having a large amount of land and being able to produce crops where you get 200 bushels or more per corn and 70, 80 bushels on the beans, you make the most money. The fallacy to that is that their input costs have gone up dramatically. So if you went back to the 70s when they were getting $3.25 a bushel, their input costs were much lower. They had less chemicals, they had less amount in the land, they had less amount in the equipment. And now the land is very high, the equipment is very high, and the chemical cost and the seed are very expensive. And some of these ag companies have virtual control. I think one company controls 78% of all the beans fields here in the United States, and they're moving into the corn as well. So as their input costs go up, the actual profit per bushel has steadily come down. And now, all of a sudden, instead of $17 a bushel for beans, there might be at $9. And the corn has dropped back down to $3.50. So why? Well, again, the experts say this is because of supply and demand. Bullwinkle. It has nothing to do it's not entirely a result of supply and demand. Now there are some factors going on here where other countries, entire continents, are refusing to buy GMO products from the United States. Now that's been that's a supply and demand kind of situation, but it doesn't have to do with the amount of beans and corns being produced. It has to do with either the politics or the science of some of these countries. I think there's only a few countries that are producing GMO crops like we are, and it's created a backlash in other countries. Also, the idea that GMO products should be labeled. I think we're the only country where we don't allow or don't insist to have those crops labeled, and particularly the food products related to that. All of Europe, all of China, all of Latin America, all of South America, all those countries require GMO labeling. The only reason we haven't goes back to a problem I've been talking about, since the beginning of these, and that is the special interest groups. They have basically taken over the publicity, the mainstream information on this, topic, and they've also infiltrated the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Environmental Protection, and I know one large company that has over 40 of their executives on these committees. So they've moved to protect themselves so they can make the most money, but they're not doing it to protect the consumer. and that's a broad statement, but I would stand on it. I think we're going to find a very strong connection between GMO crops and the kind of serious cancers, brain tumors, blood diseases, and heart disease, diabetes. All of these products, all of these diseases are related to chemicals, and a lot of that is chemicals in our food. So, well, we're now coming to a situation where the plants are becoming, the farm crops, the corn and beans are becoming resistant to the chemicals used to, make them resistant to the weeds. Hundreds of thousands of acres of beans and corn are failing this last year because of this developing resistance to these chemical products. And we're also finding that the pesticides in the soil have become resistant to these products. So you have a double whammy developing, that the chemicals are creating a wave of resistance both from the plants and from the bugs, so that what we're likely to see is an epidemic in the farm crops related to high use of these chemicals. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of going back and forth. And some would say, well, we'll just produce better chemicals, and others are saying maybe it's time to take another serious look at how we're farming, because what we completely jumped over is the whole concept of sustainable agriculture, where we had that kind of philosophy in farming where you would rotate the crops and you would try to use the least amount of chemicals that were possible. And in many cases, those crops were fed to livestock that you had on your farm. All of that has disappeared, but I think we need to take a look at it again. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to look at something that I call micro-farming. Now, the critics to this right away say, well, we're never going to go back to 1950s farm. You can't go back in history. There's just no economic sense to it. But I would argue that it's not going back to 1950s farming. We're going in a forward motion to a new style, a new culture of farming, where it's very scientific, it's very computerized, it's very educated driven, so that you'd have, let's say, a model would be you have a square mile, which we have a lot of those here in Iowa, which is 640 acres. We find an older farmer who is not farming it anymore. He's leasing it out. We make arrangements through a credit union to lease the whole 640 acres and subdivide it into 10-acre plots around the outside, which gives you 24 plots of 10 acres each around the outside, leaving you 400 acres in the middle. Now that would be used for growing corn, beans, sorghum, oats, whatever is needed to feed the animals being raised in the small micro farms. These 10-acre farms then have almost a cookie cutter kind of strategy to them. They have a large barn, and they have runners off of that large barn that are probably 3 stories high, so that on the bottom floor you have a sewage pit, so you're not running sewage out on the land as we are seeing today. And they're ventilated. You're not going to get a lot of smell. I've been in some of these confinement centers where you could walk through it with a suit and not pick up any smell inside. They can be very clean. They can also be very nasty places if they're not taken care of. But on the bottom floor of these, let's say 4 running buildings off of the big barn, in the one barn you'd have, on the bottom floor you'd have large animals like cattle or hogs or dairy cows, maybe sheep, and on the second floor you'd have smaller animals like ducks and geese and chickens, maybe rabbits, and on the third floor you'd have a greenhouse, and on the top floor of the big barn you'd have a greenhouse. So I see that you could have actually 4 families on 10 acres, and their housing is just on the other side of the big barn. So you have like a 4-plex, and you have maybe 4 or 5 bedrooms, so you're going to invite young farm families that are interested in this kind of agriculture, and it's a contract situation, so that the whole square mile is under one employee-owned contract, and everybody shares in the profits. But everybody is guaranteed a salary. So what you'd have in these 4 families is each one would have their specialties in the buildings, that run parallel to the building. And, maybe husband and wife would be taking care of hogs on one level and chickens on another level and greenhouse vegetables on the top. Another family would have maybe sheep on the bottom and turkeys on the second floor, and they would be growing tomatoes on the top floor in the greenhouse. You see, there's easily 20 or 30 different farm strategies that could be developed. Each farm family would have their own strategy, and each crop, each building would be kept as a profit center, accounting-wise, so that at the end of the year you'd know exactly what the input costs were and the sale revenue from that. Now, out of that, the families would be guaranteed maybe $24,000 apiece, so that the husband and wife would be earning about $48,000 as a base, and then they would get 50% of the overall profits of that unit, and then they might get 10 or 20% of the profits from the whole 640 acres. So it's very feasible that each farm family would be seeing incomes in the 70, 80,000 per year per family, which is what we're after. Now, that's a strategy at one level where we could have all these micro farms develop, maybe 1,000 of these units in each county here in Iowa. That would give us 100,000 new farm settings. There'd be 4 farmers per 10 acres. That would raise us to almost 400,000 farm families. And let's say the farm families all had 2 or 3, 4 kids. We're looking at bringing into the rural population another 500, 600,000 people, which is exactly what Iowa needs. We don't need more corn and beans, we need more farmers, farm families. Because what's happened since 1970s is that, first the hardware store would leave, and then the grocery store would leave, and then the bank would leave. And in many of these small towns, the only thing that is left is sort of a convenience gas station and a post office in some cases, and those are disappearing. So our strategy is to repopulate rural America, not just Iowa. This strategy could be in every state, but it also can go around the world. There are some countries that have experimented with these micro farms. I was aware of them in the Philippines. Some universities out of Denmark were actually promoting, and the government had some land that they were giving, like 5 hectares of land to young farm families, and then giving them like 25,000 pesos to buy some hogs and start a very small farm. The problem was that young people weren't interested in that kind of farming. They wanted to get off the farm, they wanted to get into the city, and what we saw was, PJ, you're going to scratch the glass. You're going to scratch the glass. Thank you. I'm getting some help here from my son. I appreciate it. What was happening was, and this is happening all over the world, people are wanting to leave the rural areas. They don't want to do that kind of farming. They want to, get a job in the city, and it's creating tremendous kinds of social pressures in communities, cities all over the world. In Mexico City today, we're seeing an average of 3,000 people under 18 come into the city every day, and they're coming from the rural areas. They're coming from areas where they were able to take care of themselves subsistently, but at least they were eating on a small farm. Now they came into a city setting, and what you find is shanty towns and some very dilapidated kinds of situations in Mexico City. When you see it on TV, you see the wide boulevards and the statues and the modern buildings, but if you go outside, you start seeing these shanty towns where thousands and thousands of people live in a square block that they've just taken over, part of a park or part of a vacant lot. And there's no running water, there's no sewage, and the disease in those is rampant. In fact, one of the diseases is an upper respiratory ailment that's affecting kids under 5. In the last few years, over 350,000 children under age 5 have died in Mexico City, and we're not even hearing about it in our mainstream news. They don't want us to connect the dots that people are leaving the rural areas, moving into these cities, devastating kinds of economic situations, and the disease is rampant in those areas. Which, when we get into the health issue, we'll bring this issue back up because of something called the swine flu epidemic that hit us here a few years ago. They claim that it came out of the hog confinements in Mexico, around Mexico City, which I think is bullwinkle too, and we'll get into that. But you can see what's happening. People are leaving rural areas and going to the cities. The cities can't accommodate them as we have them today, and this would be another reason to develop that peace highway and the peace villages, because people want to have a good living. They want to have a job. They want to be able to provide for their families. And in those countries, like some islands in the Philippines, have 60 to 70% unemployment. You know, that is right for young people to get into groups that are into violence and terrorism. Okay, so they're all connected. We need to develop a strategy to bring more people back to rural areas. I'm arguing that it can be done on these micro farms, and it'd be done in a cooperative. In fact, all of the hogs in a square mile would be sold together or in sections on a forward contract. And we'd know exactly what the price was going to be. We'd know exactly what the price of milk, the butter, the milk, every product that was being created on these micro farms could be handled in a forward contracting way as a co-op, and everybody benefits. And when it gets a little bit tight, we just reduce the overall profits sharing of the whole square mile, for example. Okay, so it's very possible we're looking at a non-zero-sum farming is what it amounts to, and it's dramatically different than the zero-sum farming that we're seeing today, where farmers are really in it to make the most money. Now they say they're raising food for the world and all of that, but they're really raising money in whatever way they can, and they're not terribly concerned, in my opinion, about erosion and loss of soil, or what's happening to our soil. And these farms that are using chemicals to grow their crops, the natural kind of elements, the bugs, the angleworms, the night crawlers, have all died. So what you're seeing is an agriculture that's based on chemicals alone. There's no natural nutrition actually coming through the plant from the soil anymore. That top 12, 14 inches is dead. Okay? That's, I think, a sad way to do agriculture. By deep plowing and rotating the crops, you can have natural nutrition, and we can get, and I know of universities that have tested this, you can get very close to the kind of production that the chemical production is getting with natural kinds of strategies. Now sometimes in organic, pure organic, it falls down because it's difficult to grow things purely organic. But if you go to a strategy with the least amount of chemicals, the most amount of sustainability in the soil, rotating your crops and that kind of strategy, you can get yields that have 200 bushels per acre on corn and 70 to 80 bushels on the beans. So they're competitive. We talk about the green revolution happening because of these chemicals, and it is true. I mean, we've certainly increased the production on corn, beans, and all the crops because of the application of science and fertilizers. But we've also created a lot of problems. And I think there's other options to how to farm, and the sustainable, more organic, less chemical approach is very viable. And we can do it on these small micro farms. And if you had 100,000 of these units, we would have stores come back, we'd have schools come back, we'd have churches come back, we'd have a lot of people in the communities providing support. That's usually about 4 support people for every farm family. And we'd also provide opportunities for these farm families to have off-farm income. I could see many of them spending 8 hours a day on the farm and then another 4 hours in a factory or in a retail store or something like that. I think they could be very viable farms. I think the families could earn twice what we're calling poverty levels. And I like the environment of small family farms. I think kids that grow up on those farms are healthier. I think they have an appreciation for work. I think they have an appreciation for the land. And I like to see that. So I'm an advocate of micro farms, of developing more and more of these strategies in Iowa and across the United States as well as around the world. And I think it's a shift in work and labor, but it's also an opportunity for people. And when we start talking about the Peace Highway and the Peace Villages, I could see one Peace Village of 200,000 basically contracting with 100 square miles of farmers around there. And if you had a choice between buying your milk, your eggs, your meat from farmers that were growing things organically and healthy, or continuing to buy milk that has gone in a truck for 1,500 miles in two weeks, and it has all these kind of chemicals that we're seeing in, like the estrogen that milk producers are using and the growth hormones. If you had that choice, I think people would make that choice easily, that they would like to contract with food producers that are healthy. I'm sure I would if I had the opportunity. I try to do that in buying food, but it's more expensive. I think the price of those foods would come down as the amount of them became available. So that's a huge strategy change, a difference in culture, and we would have then the opportunity for a lot of young families to get back into farming, which is what we need. Okay? Thank you.